I wrote a lot about silence. Certainly 10 years ago, I was writing a lot about silence. And in the past 2 years, I would say I wrote about it less. So there's an interesting paradox. And what's that about? I thought about it a little bit. Maybe the necessity of writing about silence is strongest when silence seems to be absent.
I live in New York. I'm from California originally. I went to school out in the middle of the redwoods, and silence, both silence and darkness. And obviously there are ways in which we tend to connect those two concepts in our minds, aren't things that I thought about really much at all until I moved to the middle of the city.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I certainly enjoyed the silence at the beginning of the pandemic period. You know, it was one of the, among many minuses, it was one of the pluses. And it wasn't just an acoustic silence, I would say. It was also more of a possibility to be contemplative and, to think about life in general and to think about one's own specific situation and to do things that you can't normally do. And it's a kind of quietness, I guess, is maybe more accurate as a term. But that was what I felt. And I must say, in all the weirdness and the strange loneliness of it and the fear of it, it was very enjoyable, that aspect. And I didn't feel I had to struggle with the concept of silence somehow. I mean, just there it was. There were no cars. You know, there was very little activity. And there wasn't that kind of constant communications overload or commitments, so everything kind of quietened down. And I thought, yeah, this is what I've been talking about.
How would you define the difference between silence and quietness?
Well, I think there's a number of different answers to that one. One is that silence, the implication is of an absolute condition, which of course doesn't really exist. But it's a conceptual point. I suppose it makes us think about a complete absence of sound. And then quietness is relative. And it's also very much a state of mind. So you can feel a sense of quietness even in certain noisy situations. You can feel a sense of quietness within yourself or with other people when you're in their company. And if you're listening to music, certain music can feel quiet even though it may be quite noisy. So, there are many contradictions in it. But I think, the idea of silence is almost a philosophical point, and quietness is a subjective point more. But they overlap, obviously.
Quietness is something more akin to the state that we try to achieve with meditation. Is that fair to say?
I guess so. I mean, I don't meditate, or maybe if I do meditate, I don't know it. I engage in certain activities that have a sort of meditative aspect to them, and there's certainly a kind of quietening down. But for the last 10 years, I've done a qigong class every week, or every week that I'm here, and the stress in that class is that it's not. When I say stress, I mean the emphasis is not that it's a meditation. It's a kind of way of holding bodily stances and being conscious of your body, which is rather different to meditation. So there can be a kind of a real quietening down during that. But then on the other hand, you can become very acutely aware of your surroundings. So if in recent weeks the weather has been kind of very changeable, sometimes very stormy and so on, then you can hear that and you're really listening to it, even though you're focusing on what your body is doing. So, it's again, there's this kind of paradox of, which I always talked about in relation to silence. The paradox of silence, or listening to silence, is that you become more and more acutely aware of those sounds that do exist. So as you grow closer to silence, it becomes louder and louder. And that's an interesting paradox.
I think the other paradox in terms of, both meditation and your own practice is the idea of awareness. In meditation, obviously you don't want to be focused on distractions, but that's all in service of being more mindful and acutely aware and being in the moment.
Yes, I mean, they do say that you should be able to meditate by a busy road. And the classic example from ancient China or maybe Japan is the monk meditating by the waterfall. So, to deliberately put yourself in a very noisy situation and then meditate is seen as being the test of whether you can actually meditate. But yeah, mindfulness, I don't know. I mean, awareness, I think your capacity to become aware grows if you play certain kinds of music, which depend upon listening. So improvisation, which I've been involved in for the last 50 years or so, you become very aware of what's going on around you. And you're listening more and more to detail and to movement and to dynamic shifts and to grain and texture and all of these different qualities and conditions. And inevitably that affects your hearing in general, I think.
Have you noticed a measured difference day to day?
I think it's such a gradual process, It's a bit like getting older. You don't see it moment to moment, but 1 month you look in the mirror and you think, my God, I'm older. It's this idea of transformation. So I think it's the same with listening awareness, that it happens over time and maybe a long time. And if I listen back to tapes of myself playing with other people, say in the early 70s, then I think there are moments I can actually hear myself not listening carefully to what's going on. It's like, how did you miss that?
In terms of almost an analogy of being a car on the highway and missing your on-ramp or missing your exit?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, exactly. That is the kind of thing that can happen in improvisation, that it's coming up, it's signposted, there it is, but you drive straight past it. And you think, how did that happen? But it happens through a lack of attentiveness, a lack of mindfulness. And I mean, these things happen anyway. And how many times do we have conversations when we think somebody gave us an opportunity, an opening, a cue to enter into a difficult subject, but we missed the cue, probably because we didn't want to go there. Or maybe we were too wrapped up in our own thoughts and, whatever, that we missed it.
Obviously something that I think a lot about in the conversations that I have just in life and here and generally, because I think we've all been there waiting to get are questioning and not listening and not being open to the other person. And I suspect that I'm not really much of a musician myself, but I suspect that when you do first start that process of improvising and playing with people, you're in your own head and you're really focused on how you sound and the performance that you're giving. And that doesn't open you up to others in the way that perhaps you would like to be.
That's exactly right. I mean, when I was teaching improvisation classes, that's exactly what I used to find, that people were just so wrapped up in their own focus in what they're doing, or their own anxieties, or their concerns about their sound, whether certain things were happening with their computer or whatever it was they were using, and you're not listening to anybody. And so the process of teaching is trying to open up that facility. I must say it doesn't necessarily come with being a musician. I remember years ago I interviewed Lamont Young, and his answer to my first question lasted, I think, 45 minutes. It's just like this.
My job here is done, right? Just I'll go make some tea, and you can take this rest of the way.
Yeah, you just press the button and leave, and so this unceasing flow, and where you're just waiting to be able to jump in, But yeah, I mean, generally speaking, I think certain kinds of music, at least, can help you develop that faculty, for sure. And of something I used to say to my students when I was running improvisation classes was that, I'm not necessarily training you to become an improviser, as a kind of career. If you stick with it, you will find what you learned useful in other situations. So, being able to listen, I think, not everybody has it. And those who do have it certainly can negotiate certain situations better.
When you say situations, you're not just referring to music. It sounds like you're referring to life.
No. I'm talking about life. Yeah. And also I'm talking about listening in the broadest sense. Maybe not just your ears, your hearing, but your bodily response to the world, and what you notice and what you don't notice. As you said, mindfulness. Yeah. So that to me is listening. As a complex process. And if you can listen, if you have that awareness, then it can help you in a lot of things in life. I mean, that's all very well to say, but we've all been in situations where we know in retrospect that we weren't listening. In relationships, friendships, whatever. Professional situations, we just weren't hearing what was being said to us.
It's also a very underrated part of teaching. And I say that as someone who has had his fair share of teachers who have not been good listeners.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And if you teach yourself, then I think it's something you have to constantly remind yourself. Am I listening? Because after some years of teaching, you can get into habits, and you've got a kind of routine, just to survive. And you develop ways of dealing with people, with students, and all that can lead to a situation where you're not hearing anybody or anything. And of course, it becomes acutely obvious the longer you go on, because the weird thing about teaching is that you're getting older and your students are getting younger. I mean, they're not getting younger, but they're getting younger in relation to you. So the gap between their experience, their understanding of the world, the things that they're excited by or bored by, become more and more remote to you as you go along. So your capacity to listen to them and, you know, what they're responding to, what they're, you know, indifferent to is extremely important if you want to keep a good relationship with them.
I've certainly felt this in myself too, feeling like there needs to be hard and fast rules around music, around art. And I think that's what you're speaking to a certain extent, in terms of their own context changing. Yours hopefully not staying too stationary, but probably that's unavoidable to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Do you find that as you've continued teaching that your notions around sound and music have become more alien to your students?
Well, I retired last year. I was a professor at London College of Communication, and I was there for over 20 years. So that's a good... And I retired at the age of 72, which is, you know, quite old to be in an institution of mostly young people. But on the other hand, I found one of the things that happened to me every year was that I learned a lot from the students. I was teaching improvisation and developed good relationships, friendships with some of them, and actually work with them now. So that is as much a benefit to me as it was or is to them, or hopefully is to them. But I think you do become conscious of it. I mean, I remember I was a couple of, probably 3-4 years ago, I was teaching a group of students. They were in the first year, and they'd only recently started their course. And one very young guy said to me, I've been talking about this and that, I can't remember what, and he said, I just don't understand modern art. And I thought, what kind of question is that? You know, I don't think I've heard this expression modern art for years, you know, and it was the kind of thing my parents would have said.
And that's probably also the kind of art he was talking about. You know, it probably was abstract impressionism, and it probably were these things from 50, 60 years ago.
Exactly. So, you know, to hear this coming out of the mouth of a, I don't know, 20-year-old was just extraordinary. And I did a double take, you know, and in those situations you have to be very careful because you can end up ridiculing a student. You know, he's probably sensitive and probably very conscious of how he's treated in that situation. And, you know, so you have to take a deep breath before you answer that kind of thing. But it did shock me. I mean, it was like, oh, okay, that whole thing has come round again, has it? And so it's not simply that you're keeping up with their particular tastes, you know, what bands they like or whatever it is. It's also that a kind of conservatism can come back around, and something you thought was, you know, gone and in the past, consigned to history, is suddenly a live issue. I mean, I think we've seen that in all kinds of situations in recent years, you know, that things that we thought had gone away have come back again. But yeah, it's very much part of the job, you know, demanding part of the job to remain alert to how your students are changing. And, you know, certain things that they reject because to them maybe it represents their parents, certain ideas, you know. I mean, even the idea of improvisation itself could represent a certain kind of view that was, or something that was very prevalent in the 1960s and 1970s. So in itself, it's identifiable with parents and old stuff and ancient history. So, you have to deal with that.
I'm somewhat sympathetic to this statement. I likely wouldn't have said it in the same words, but to the statement, I don't understand modern art. And I wonder if, in that context, he was also using that to include, what we would deem experimental music, because these are things that you need a guide. You need someone in your life, or maybe it's a book, but you need somebody to explain the context to you and to bring you around to it. Taking music and popular music, there are certain things that I think we grew up hearing and have accepted as what pretty music sounds like or pop music sounds like, and it can be difficult and abrasive to come around to some of these other ideas.
That's absolutely right. I remember when I was at school, maybe 15 years old or something, and I had a great teacher who I'm still to some degree in touch with, a guy named Michael Evans. And I was looking at Picasso's painting of the three musicians. I said to him, I don't get this. And he gave me a kind of 5-10 minute sort of analysis of what was going on in that painting. And by the time he'd finished that brief analysis, it was like, I get it all. It's like a light came on in my head. And yeah, it was like a light came on in my head. And I think, okay, it probably would have taken me a few more years or whatever, maybe even a few more months to get to grips with this myself. But having him talk about this work and the context out of which it arose and what was going on with it and where it sat within Picasso's development and so on was just priceless. And you do need guides from time to time. And if you have good guides, then you're very fortunate.
I'd watched a performance that you gave, and I don't remember the specific details, but you came on ahead of time and said, I don't usually give a preamble, or I don't usually explain it, but there were a certain set of circumstances that required you to give some additional context in that. And I always sense this a bit of a tug of war in a lot of artists between the impulse to let things speak for themselves, but also maybe hold the listener's hand to a certain extent.
Yeah, I think maybe you're talking about a performance I did at the Icon Gallery in Birmingham, which was it was in an exhibition by an artist, Barry Flanagan, who's no longer alive, and it was referring to a performance I'd given with a poet performance artist called Carlisle Reedy and a musician I used to work with, Paul Burwell, and we performed in the 1970s in a Barry Flanagan exhibition. And so it was, it was complex. It was not, you couldn't have gathered any of these details if I'd just gone ahead and played. So yeah, on the whole, I would tend to just start playing without any explanation. But on that occasion, I felt, we're in a gallery, we're in the middle of somebody's exhibition. I'm using recordings of music by one person who is now dead. I'm using recordings of a person speaking who is kind of reclusive, so she's not here, and people don't see her around, and she's maybe a little bit forgotten, but she's an interesting artist. And so it seemed necessary to offer that kind of guidance. But I think, you have to pick and choose, and you have to do it carefully. The thing I don't like is when people kind of come on and they tell you exactly what's going to happen.
Not just what's going to happen, but how you should feel about it and the effect that it should have.
That's right, yeah. And to some degree, that's a part of art curation these days. Putting together an exhibition, and each work has a little description. And an indication of what was going on with the work, and maybe what they thought you would feel about it. Well, that to me is very contentious, but because there are many different ways to think about what an artist was doing. This morning, I just finished writing a catalogue essay about a work by a Canadian artist, Stan Douglas, and the work is called Luanda Kinshasa. And its initial inspiration was a Miles Davis record, On the Corner. And Stan Douglas's works tend to have a lot of layers, so you could come into the gallery and you could take it at face value and you could enjoy it. But then, you go a little bit below that and there's another layer, and then below that there's another, and so on, and there's all kinds of things going on that you have to be very alert to notice. And so, my job writing an essay like that is to kind of unpick it. So if you go to the show, the show is going to be in Oslo. So if you go to that show in Oslo and you see the work and it's a bunch of musicians playing a riff or a kind of one chord jam, you could think, yeah, this is nice, I like this. But then if you read my essay, then you'll see that there are many reference points.
I suspect that you're probably like me to a certain extent, in that hearing about a new artist or, seeing something in a gallery, I immediately want to run home and read everything about it if it had that effect on me. You had said that you'd alluded to I guess a change in presentation when it comes to galleries. You use the words "these days" to describe how galleries approach works. Is that has there been a fundamental transformation as far as the way art is presented now?
I think so. Particularly in what you might call public galleries rather than private galleries. I think with private galleries, it's still kind of mysterious. You have to do your own work. But although very often a private gallery will print out a kind of information sheet, but in public galleries and museums, I think they're much more visitor friendly, I guess is the term they would use. Museums used to be sometimes quite difficult places, which made them really atmospheric and strange very often, but they didn't make too many concessions to the visitor. Whereas now, there's a lot of effort goes into it, to make. And I noticed that a few weeks ago, I took my granddaughter to the British Museum. She's 6. And I was a little bit worried that she might be bored. But actually everything is laid out in such a careful way, and it's very atmospheric, and, there are just these little things about the way you can look at things that make the whole thing exciting for a 6-year-old. So, yeah, I think that has changed, definitely.
Yeah, I'm old enough to have a certain romanticization for radio, turning something on and hearing a piece of music and realizing that you might not ever hear it again. And that is certainly something that is missing now from the conversation.
Yeah, I can remember experiences listening to radio where a piece of music came on and it's just like it's something extraordinary coming out of nowhere. And your response to it is intensified by that particular circumstance. The fact that you weren't expecting it and you don't know what it is. So yeah, sure, I agree. And so it becomes more and more rare where you experience those surprises. But then on the other hand, I subscribe to a streaming service called Mubi, which I don't know, you probably know it, but it's kind of what you might call art house films. And They have a new one every day. And 2 nights ago, I watched Jean Vigo's film, L'Atalante. And I don't know why I'd never seen it before. And, because it's supposed to be one of the greatest films ever made, if you take any notice of that kind of evaluation. But I was just staggered by it. I was really just shocked by it. And, you mentioned going to an exhibition and, finding an artist you like and going home and researching it. Well, that's what I did. I went on YouTube and I found a conversation between Eric Romer and Francois Truffaut discussing the film, which was great. And, researching Vigo and the film itself. And actually, it's a shock that at my age, coming up to 73, I can experience something like that, that something I've never come across before. And that, it dates from 1930, so it's been around long enough for me to catch up with it. So why I haven't seen it, I don't know. But what a pleasure, what an amazing thing to experience something that affects you that much. And it's slightly different to what you're talking about because, I knew what I signed up to when I made the decision. It wasn't like it was a mystery film. And then, as it was progressing, I thought I must know more about this film. And of course, it's easy for us to go about that these days. You immediately go online and you go on YouTube and whatever, and it's all there, or some of it's there. So it is a bit different, but yeah, that sense of surprise is much more of a rare thing.
Truffaut is an interesting case, and I wonder if you feel a kinship with him generally. In certainly there are examples of this, but fewer than I think you would suspect of artists who are also supporters of the arts and are also critics and will also discuss other people's work in depth. There tends to be a lot of siloing when it comes to that. And obviously you found two distinct but connected careers in being, I wouldn't say a critic, but in being, somebody who writes about music and who creates music.
Yeah, I think Truffaut is an interesting example, an anomaly. And when you hear him talking about L'Atalante, he's, you can tell he's also a critic. The way he's able to analyze the film and contextualize it, and the way he knows everything about it, all the actors, and it's a real pleasure to listen to. But it is a rare thing, and people are still to some degree suspicious of it.
Why is that?
Well, I think it's still this romantic idea that the artist should be a kind of inarticulate idiot who's a genius at what they do, and the critic is this kind of remote figure who has no idea how anything is really done, but they have a capacity to write. And I think actually, if you know how records are made, then it's advantageous. If you know what the experience of making music is like with other people, then it's advantageous. And at the same time, if you're able to analyze music, then that can be advantageous too, although I can see the potential drawbacks as well.
In my own career, as somebody who has written about music and art, and my primary job is writing about technology, I constantly wish that I had not just the vocabulary, but a level of experience that I don't have in the creation of these processes. I can approach things as a writer, but I feel like I'm missing some pretty key elements to the work if I don't have the theory or the language.
Yeah, it's certainly a very particular experience coming out in front of an audience, and knowing that you're going to play and not really knowing what's going to happen. And, there's that feeling, momentary feeling maybe, that this could go terribly wrong. And that particular experience is Well, you can feel it as a writer as well. You can feel yourself as you're beginning to write. You think
Certainly, as an interviewer, absolutely. Because I've had that happen. I've tried to interview those brick walls that you mentioned before, and it's a terrible experience.
Awful. Yeah. I interviewed Brian Wilson once, and it was just absolute torture. It was so difficult.
There's something in there, but you don't, like with him especially, there's something in there and you don't have the keys to unlock it.
I mean, the keys have been thrown away long ago. So, and particularly if it's somebody like him, that you more or less idolize, and you're so in awe of their work, and there's just nothing you can get out of this situation. So, yes, I agree. There's that sense of trepidation, anxiety before you start an interview like that, and then it can go horribly wrong and you feel just terrible. And similarly, you start to write a piece and there's just nothing there. I mean, I had that last year. I felt so I had a practice at one point, and then I was commissioned to write a catalogue essay, and it was just torture. I mean, the words were coming out one by one, more or less. And so, I think performance anxiety can affect anybody, really, whatever their occupation.
There's the obvious case of something that has been commissioned, whether it's writing an essay or a piece of music, which I know you've done commission work as well. And I assume that the nature of that is different than generally if you're going to be making an album or writing a book. Are those two processes similar for you from the standpoint of amassing the pieces, the ingredients that go into them over time?
There are similarities, yes. There are big differences too. To some degree, it depends on the method you use and the technology you use. So if we're talking about me making a kind of album in which I put everything together in the computer, then there are very strong similarities in the sense that if I'm writing a piece or a book, I tend to make notes. I don't really prepare. I don't write out a schema which I'm going to follow, but I do make a lot of notes and I research things. And in the same way, if I'm making a record, I'll probably make sounds and work on transforming them and assemble like a library almost. And then you have a way of beginning, which I always feel is very important. Like, beginning to write a text, an essay. It's incredibly important for me to have a good sentence at the beginning. And if I get a good sentence, then often I'm off and running. But if I don't, then I'm stuck. And it's the same way with music. I'll begin with a sound, maybe. And then it just develops, and I'll add things to it, and I'll record things specially for it, or I'll invite somebody to come in and do something with it. A singer or an instrumentalist or whatever. So there are definitely parallels in the process, but clearly they are also working from different areas of the brain. So there's a different feeling about it. And a different, if you're writing, you're working with language. And so it's overlapping onto that whole area of life, which is different from the musical side of things, which is, unless you're talking about songs, is largely nonverbal. And even if you're talking about songs, a lot of it is probably going to be non-verbal. So, there are big differences, and those differences are very interesting. How we make connections, I suppose, between those two very disparate areas of life.
We discussed a little bit how being a musician has positively influenced your ability to write about music, and I'm wondering how much it's a two-way street, in that I suspect part of the reason why there is a separation for a lot of people is because there's a concern that being too analytical about being an artist can ruin the purity of making art.
Yeah, there is that belief. Although it's very unusual to come across an artist who's got nothing whatsoever to say. I do know musicians who are very reluctant to talk about what they're doing. But as a musician myself, I'm very used to sitting around with musicians and talking about ideas. And then they're very free-flowing in what they talk about, what they like, what they don't like, or who's what they relate to or not, and who their influences, and so on and so forth. And very often they clam up if they're faced with an interviewer asking them questions. So that's maybe just a general suspicion of somebody who's being analytical about them and a resistance. But even then, that's not everybody. Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing to say is that the technological aspect of it, that if I'm sitting here with this grey and black box, which is doing things for me, and I'm working with files, then a file is a file, right? I mean, there are many different types of files, but they're still files. And, you open files in slightly different ways, but not that different. So that compression, I suppose, of the tools you use, the activity, the nature of the activity has made a massive difference. We're not talking about violins and quill pens anymore. Although actually there's you could argue that there's a close relationship between a violin and a quill pen also. But it's, what I'm saying, it's slightly different. But I think that improvisation has been very important to the way I write. As I said, I don't really plan. So I assemble a lot of thoughts, maybe writing them down in a notebook. And then when I start writing, things hopefully move from one thing to the next. And I can write in kind of quite large blocks in an improvised way. And then I'll stop and I'll have to rethink or do some more research or whatever, or consider what I've written. But it has an improvisatory feel to it.
I'm very interested in this idea of music improvisation, as far as these instances that I had heard you describe in other interviews, where in some cases you had never met the musicians. In some cases, you weren't familiar with their work. That is, in a way, sort of the ultimate nonverbal communication. How much of an impact does that have to collaborate with somebody on the spot who you're really just meeting for the first time?
Yeah, it happened to me recently, actually. Not the last gig I did, but the one before that. And I was asked at the last minute by John Butcher, saxophone player, if I would dep, as musicians say, for somebody else who was supposed to be on the gig, but who had COVID. So, I mean, that's a common story at the moment. But the other two musicians, I not only had not met them, I didn't know their work. John's request came in kind of last minute, just because of the nature of getting COVID. And so I had to make a decision. What do I pack? Because, I have a number of different setups that I use. I'm always trying to change up or refresh my setup, the things I use in a gig, just to keep myself interested or slightly off balance. And normally I would make a decision based on factors I know. But in this case, I thought, wow, I don't know what they do. So I looked at a few things on YouTube, and that didn't help me that much. So I just worked on instinct. And actually, it was a beautiful gig. It was fantastic. And, I think for everybody there was a kind of unsettling. But as soon as we did the sound check, there was this feeling, oh, okay, this is going to work. And then you feel confident, but I think you have to feel a sort of base confidence. And, certainly I have that after doing this activity for over 50 years. I have that base confidence, otherwise I wouldn't be able to continue. And also a confidence in other people. That coming back to the beginning of our conversation, that they're going to be listeners, their confidence that you're going to be a listener, and you're going to respond, and they're going to respond in intelligent and stimulating ways.
This idea of being off balance is a funny one, and I do think it relates to that, what we were discussing in terms of being a teacher, putting yourself outside of your comfort zone, lest you be too sort of caught up in your old ways. You do need that base level of confidence just to stand up in front of people on stage and perform something. But why is it important to throw yourself off balance to some degree?
Well, I think habit. That human beings by nature are habitual for very good reasons, because survival to some extent depends on habit mixed with improvisation. And a sense of adventurism can grow out of habit, in the sense that if certain things are habitual in your life, in other words, comfortable and known, then that gives you a platform from which to go and have your adventures. And I think in the field of art and writing and music and so on, habits accumulate over time in your life, and there are various traps. And one of the traps is audience expectations, and another one is success. I mean, somebody who becomes very successful, an artist, say, or a musician, and it becomes impossible to do anything else, they're in a trap, really. And it depends on their personality, whether they're comfortable with that trap or whether it becomes a source of bitterness and frustration. And for me, I always felt that improvisation is about challenging yourself. And the strange thing that we find, now that the music has a long history, or a longish history, is that you can become very habitual. You can do the same thing every single time. And some people will enjoy that, and you can enjoy it. But it's not my approach to life, let's say. I'm not comfortable. Sometimes I wish I was, but I'm not comfortable with just settling with one thing, settling down to that, and then just doing 1,000 versions of it. I always want to find something new, find variations.
I approached you to speak, I mean, obviously based on wanting to talk to you and appreciate your work, but also I posted something on, I think, Facebook about some reissues of some albums from, I think, the late 90s. And as somebody whose work is so tied to improvisation and live music, it must be interesting to go back and revisit this document from multiple decades ago. Obviously, there's music that you create that's intended to just sort of exist in the moment and vanish into the ether. Maybe somebody will be recording it and post it on YouTube, maybe not. Is the approach dramatically different when you sit down and put something on record?
Yeah, it's interesting. On the one hand, I've got the reissues from, as you say, the late 90s, 96, 97, coming out on vinyl. But then I've also been working on a much bigger project, which is rehearsal tapes and recordings made in the early 70s. So a lot of them on cassettes, and that's a huge project.
Things that weren't made to be shared widely necessarily.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's going to be like one of these ridiculous, lush 10 LP sets with books and the whole work. So that's been a huge amount of work and very weird for me. It's very weird going back to that point in time, and you're dealing with music made by people who've died, and you have complex histories with everybody, and a lot of the stuff you've forgotten is just too long ago, and the documentation is patchy. And then at the same time, and also, the lowest imaginable technology, these kind of cheap cassette recordings. And then you go to the 90s music, which was made in studios, obviously. At that time, I was composing, using sequencing software, taking that into the studio, mixing that with live musicians. So you've got a whole different, more complex technological scenario. And working on those two projects more or less at the same time was very strange, partly because of the differences between them and the difficulties they both threw up, but also because you're dealing with your own past. So you're revisiting who you were at that time and everything associated with it. So you're kind of dredging up the emotional feeling and all of the difficulties you were going through at that time as well. I don't know, it's very strange. I mean, I think it's kind of dangerous almost, that you can get drawn back into this nostalgic feeling.
I would maybe even take that a step further as somebody whose work is so tied to the ways in which you push yourself forward and are constantly trying to do new things. It must be strange to not enshrine yourself, but to go back and to revisit some of these old works.
It is. And it's interesting, because I've got no objections to recording work or, anything like that. But my musical partner of that time in the early 1970s, Paul Burwell, he did develop this kind of aversion to recording. His argument was that recording is a kind of shadow of a real event, which of course is true. That's undeniable. The complexity of a real event in space is very, very different to a recording that you're listening back through speakers. I think about that, and I used to say to him, I understand what you're talking about, but if you don't record your work and release it, then nobody knows what you're doing. So there's this pragmatic aspect to it. That if you want to work with audiences, then, okay, you can say, I'm purely a local person. You're like a village person who plays to their family or friends or, passers-by. But it's very hard to maintain that fantasy in, current situation. And I think what I used to say to him, that you're in danger of being completely forgotten, overlooked, has become true. So he has friends who are still alive who work hard to keep his legacy in view, and that's partly what this whole project is about. Yeah, it's almost like you're making a deal with the devil, if you get involved in the whole business of recording. But I can't see, given our situation, that there's really an alternative, unless you're happy.
Yeah, and I think it connects back to that the museum thing we were discussing before, where you said it's this new phenomenon where they're giving you all the context, they're bombarding with it you with it up front, and there's a reason they're doing that. They're doing that because they want people to come through the door, because people have to come through the door in order for the museum to continue to operate. So there are just compromises that we need to make in life to whatever principles that, frankly, that as I'm getting older, that I'm realizing may have been held in a somewhat arbitrary fashion, that we need to give in order to keep moving forward.
Yeah, I agree with that. And if I think about his life, you know, he died in appalling circumstances. He'd become alienated from everybody around him, and you know, the situation was just really distressing, and you couldn't help feeling that he'd created this situation in which there was no way out of that. And, you know, that uncompromising attitude, which was something I guess he and I both really admired when we were really young, you know, in our 20s, early 20s, can become just a cul-de-sac, really. And unless you want to die really young, you know, it's I don't know, you know, maybe he would listen to the work I do now and say, well, you know, there's something artificial about it, you know, that I'm working with computers and I'm working with ways of assembling music that are alien, but maybe he wouldn't. I don't know. I made a record. I can't remember the date. It would have been in the 2000s, early 2000s, and I used some of his playing on the record, you know, but I was obviously assembling it digitally in the computer. And he was interested. You know, he was kind of interested in the process and interested in the possibilities. And I think it's a pity that he's not around now to say to him, look, in a live improvisation context, you could be flourishing, but you could also be getting involved with this other way of making music, which can be very, very interesting and which can combine the two approaches. That's not going to happen because, you know, he died. But, I mean, I think from my point of view, I find these two strategies, if you like, really fascinating, and the way they connect with each other and the way they differ from each other.